Part 6.
Now the group outside the window had within the last few minutes been reinforced by new arrivals. Some of them respectable shopkeepers and their assistants, who had come out for a whiff of air after putting up the shutters for the night. Some of them of a lower class. Distinct from either, there appeared a stranger, a young man of remarkably pleasant aspect, who carried in his hand a carpet-bag of the smart floral pattern prevalent in such articles at that time. He was ruddy and of a fair countenance, bright-eyed and slight in build. He might possibly have passed by without stopping at all, or at most for half a minute to glance in at the scene, had not his advent coincided with the discussion on corn and bread, in which event this history had never been enacted. But the subject seemed to arrest him, and he whispered some inquiries of the other bystanders, and remained listening. When he heard Henchard's closing words, "It can't be done," he smiled, impulsively drew out his pocketbook, and wrote down a few words by the aid of the light in the window. He tore out the leaf, folded and directed it, and seemed about to throw it in through the open sash upon the dining table. But, on second thoughts, edged himself through the loiterers, till he reached the door of the hotel, where one of the waiters who had been serving inside was now idly leaning against the doorpost. "Give this to the mayor at once," he said, handing in his hasty note. Elizabeth Jane had seen his movements and heard the words, which attracted her both by their subject and by their accent. A strange one for those parts. It was quaint and northerly. The waiter took the note, while the young stranger continued, "And can you tell me of a respectable hotel that's a little more moderate than this?" The waiter glanced indifferently up and down the street. "They say the Three Mariners, just below here, is a very good place," he languidly answered, "but I have never stayed there myself." The Scotchman, as he seemed to be, thanked him, and strolled on in the direction of the Three Mariners aforesaid, apparently more concerned about the question of an inn than about the fate of his note, now that the momentary impulse of writing it was over. While he was disappearing slowly down the street, the waiter left the door, and Elizabeth Jane saw with some interest the note brought into the dining room and handed to the mayor. Henchard looked at it carelessly, unfolded it with one hand, and glanced it through. Thereupon it was curious to note an unexpected effect. The nettled, clouded aspect which had held possession of his face since the subject of his corn dealings had been broached, changed itself into one of arrested attention. He read the note slowly and fell into thought, not moody, but fitfully intense, as that of a man who has been captured by an idea. By this time, toasts and speeches had given place to songs, the wheat subject being quite forgotten. Men were putting their heads together in twos and threes, telling good stories with pantomimic laughter which reached convulsive grimace. Some were beginning to look as if they did not know how they had come there, what they had come for, or how they were going to get home again, and Brovey silently sat on with a dazed smile. Square-built men showed a tendency to become hunchbacks. Men with a dignified presence lost it in a curious obliquity of figure, in which their features grew disarranged and one-sided, whilst the heads of a few who had dined with extreme thoroughness were somehow sinking into their shoulders, the corners of their mouth and eyes being bent upwards by the subsidence. Only Henchard did not conform to these flexuous changes. He remained stately and vertical, silently thinking. The clock struck 9. Elizabeth Jane turned to her companion. "The evening is drawing on, Mother," she said. "What do you propose to do?" She was surprised to find how irresolute her mother had become. "We must get a place to lie down in," she murmured. "I have seen Mr. Henchard, and that's all I wanted to do." "That's enough for tonight at any rate," Elizabeth Jane replied soothingly. "We can think tomorrow what is best to do about him. The question now is it not? How shall we find a lodging?" As her mother did not reply, Elizabeth Jane's mind reverted to the words of the waiter, that the Three Mariners was an inn of moderate charges. A recommendation good for one person was probably good for another. "Let's go where the young man has gone to," she said. "He is respectable. What do you say?" Her mother assented, and down the street they went. In the meantime, the mayor's thoughtfulness, engendered by the note as stated, continued to hold him in abstraction, till, whispering to his neighbor to take his place, he found opportunity to leave the chair. This was just after the departure of his wife and Elizabeth. Outside the door of the assembly room, he saw the waiter, and beckoning to him, asked who brought the note which had been handed in a quarter of an hour before. "A young man, sir, a sort of traveler. He was a Scotchman, seemingly." "Did he say how he had got it?" "He wrote it himself, sir, as he stood outside the window." "Oh, wrote it himself. Is the young man in the hotel?" "No, sir. He went to the Three Mariners, I believe." The mayor walked up and down the vestibule of the hotel with his hands under his coat-tails, as if he were merely seeking a cooler atmosphere than that of the room he had quitted. But there could be no doubt that he was in reality still possessed to the full by the new idea, whatever that might be. At length, he went back to the door of the dining room, paused, and found that the songs, toasts, and conversation were proceeding quite satisfactorily without his presence. The corporation, private residents, and major and minor tradesmen had in fact gone in for comforting beverages to such an extent that they had quite forgotten not only the mayor, but all those vast political, religious, and social differences which they felt necessary to maintain in the daytime, and which separated them like iron grills. Seeing this, the mayor took his hat, and when the waiter had helped him on with a thin holland overcoat, went out and stood under the portico. Very few persons were now in the street, and his eyes, by a sort of attraction, turned and dwelt upon a spot about 100 yards further down. It was the house to which the writer of the note had gone, the Three Mariners, whose two prominent Elizabethan gables, bow window and passage light, could be seen from where he stood. Having kept his eyes on it for a while, he strolled in that direction. This ancient house of accommodation for man and beast, now unfortunately pulled down, was built of mellow sandstone, with unlined windows of the same material, markedly out of perpendicular from the settlement of foundations. The bay window projecting into the street, whose interior was so popular among the frequenters of the inn, was closed with shutters, in each of which appeared a heart-shaped aperture, somewhat more attenuated in the right and left ventricles than is seen in nature. Inside these illuminated holes, at a distance of about 3 inches, were ranged at this hour, as every passer knew, the ruddy poles of Billy Wills the glazier, Smart the shoemaker, Busford the general dealer, and others of a secondary set of worthies, of a grade somewhat below that of the diners at the King's Arms, each with his yard of clay. A 4-centered Tudor arch was over the entrance, and over the arch the signboard, now visible in the rays of an opposite lamp. Hereon, the mariners, who had been represented by the artist as persons of 2 dimensions only, in other words, flat as a shadow, were standing in a row in paralyzed attitudes. Being on the sunny side of the street, the 3 comrades had suffered largely from warping, splitting, fading, and shrinkage, so that they were but a half-invisible film upon the reality of the grain and knots and nails which composed the signboard. As a matter of fact, this state of things was not so much owing to Stanage, the landlord's neglect, as from the lack of a painter in Casterbridge who would undertake to reproduce the features of men so traditional. A long, narrow, dimly lit passage gave access to the inn, within which which passage, the horses going to their stalls at the back, and the coming and departing human guests, rubbed shoulders indiscriminately, the latter running no slight risk of having their toes trodden upon by the animals. The good stabling and the good ale of the mariners, though somewhat difficult to reach on account of there being but this narrow way to both, were nevertheless perseveringly sought out by the sagacious old heads who knew what was what in Casterbridge. Henchard stood without the inn for a few instants, then lowering the dignity of his presence as much as possible by buttoning the brown holland coat over his shirt front, and in other ways toning himself down to his ordinary everyday appearance, he entered the inn door.
Part 7.
Elizabeth Jane and her mother had arrived some 20 minutes earlier. Outside the house they had stood and considered whether even this homely place, though recommended as moderate, might not be too serious in its prices for their light pockets. Finally, however, they had found courage to enter, and duly met Stanage the landlord, a silent man, who drew and carried frothing measures to this room and to that shoulder to shoulder with his waiting maids, a stately slowness, however, entering into his ministrations by contrast with theirs, as became one whose service was somewhat optional. It would have been altogether optional but for the orders of the landlady, a person who sat in the bar, corporeally motionless, but with a flitting eye and quick ear with which she observed and heard through the open door and hatchway the pressing needs of customers whom her husband overlooked though close at hand. Elizabeth and her mother were passively accepted as sojourners and shown to a small bedroom under one of the gables, where they sat down. The principle of the inn seemed to be to compensate for the antique awkwardness, crookedness, and obscurity of the passages, floors, and windows, by quantities of clean linen spread about everywhere, and this had a dazzling effect upon the travelers. "'Tis too good for us, we can't meet it," said the elder woman, looking round the apartment with misgiving as soon as they were left alone. "I fear it is too," said Elizabeth, "but we must be respectable." "We must pay our way even before we must be respectable," replied her mother. "Mr. Henchard is too high for us to make ourselves known to him, I much fear, so we've only our own pockets to depend on." "I know what I'll do," said Elizabeth Jane, after an interval of waiting, during which their needs seemed quite forgotten under the press of business below. And leaving the room, she descended the stairs and penetrated to the bar. If there was one good thing more than another which characterized this single-hearted girl, it was a willingness to sacrifice her personal comfort and dignity to the common weal.
"As you seem busy here tonight, and mother's not well off, might I take out part of our accommodation by helping?" she asked of the landlady. The latter, who remained as fixed in the armchair as if she had been melted into it when in a liquid state, and could not now be unstuck, looked the girl up and down inquiringly with her hands on the chair arms. Such arrangements as the one Elizabeth proposed were not uncommon in country villages, but though Casterbridge was old-fashioned, the custom was well-nigh obsolete here. The mistress of the house, however, was an easy woman to strangers, and she made no objection. Thereupon Elizabeth, being instructed by nods and motions from the taciturn landlord as to where she could find the different things, trotted up and downstairs with materials for her own and her parents' meal. While she was doing this, the wood partition in the center of the house thrilled to its center with the tugging of a bell pull upstairs. A bell below tinkled a note that was feebler in sound than the twanging of wires and cranks that had produced it. "'Tis the Scotch gentleman," said the landlady omnisciently, and turning her eyes to Elizabeth. "Now then, can you go and see if his supper is on the tray? If it is, you can take it up to him. The front room over this." Elizabeth Jane, though hungry, willingly postponed serving herself a while, and applied to the cook in the kitchen, whence she brought forth the tray of supper viands, and proceeded with it upstairs to the apartment indicated. The accommodation of the three mariners was far from spacious, despite the fair area of ground it covered. The room demanded by intrusive beams and rafters, partitions, passages, staircases, disused ovens, settles, and four-posters, left comparatively small quarters for human beings. Moreover, this being at a time before home brewing was abandoned by the smaller victuallers, and a house in which the 12-bushel strength was still religiously adhered to by the landlord in his ale, the quality of the liquor was the chief attraction of the premises, so that everything had to make way for utensils and operations in connection therewith. Thus Elizabeth found that the Scotchman was located in a room quite close to the small one that had been allotted to herself and her mother. When she entered nobody was present, but the young man himself, the same whom she had seen lingering without the windows of the King's Arms Hotel. He was now idly reading a copy of the local paper, and was hardly conscious of her entry, so that she looked at him quite coolly, and saw how his forehead shone where the light caught it, and how nicely his hair was cut, and the sort of velvet pile, or down that was on the skin at the back of his neck, and how his cheek was so truly curved as to be part of a globe, and how clearly drawn were the lids and lashes which hid his bent eyes. She set down the tray, spread his supper, and went away without a word. On her arrival below, the landlady, who was as kind as she was fat and lazy, saw that Elizabeth Jane was rather tired, though in her carelessness to be useful she was waiving her own needs altogether. Mrs. Stanage thereupon said, with a considerate peremptoriness, that she and her mother had better take their own suppers if they meant to have any. Elizabeth fetched their simple provisions, as she had fetched the Scotchman's, and went up to the little chamber where she had left her mother, noiselessly pushing open the door with the edge of the tray. To her surprise, her mother, instead of being reclined on the bed where she had left her, was in an erect position, with lips parted. At Elizabeth's entry, she lifted her finger. The meaning of this was soon apparent. The room allotted to the two women had at one time served as a dressing-room to the Scotchman's chamber, as was evidenced by signs of a door of communication between them now screwed up and pasted over with the wall-paper. But, as is frequently the case with hotels of far higher pretensions than the Three Mariners, every word spoken in either of these rooms was distinctly audible in the other. Such sounds came through now. Thus silently conjured, Elizabeth deposited the tray, and her mother whispered as she drew near, "'Tis he." "Who?" said the girl. "The mayor." The tremors in Susan Henchard's tone might have led any person, but one so perfectly unsuspicious of the truth as the girl was, to surmise some closer connection than the admitted simple kinship as a means of accounting for them. Two men were indeed talking in the adjoining chamber, the young Scotchman and Henchard, who, having entered the inn while Elizabeth Jane was in the kitchen waiting for the supper, had been deferentially conducted upstairs by host Stanage himself. The girl noiselessly laid out their little meal, and beckoned to her mother to join her, which Mrs. Henchard mechanically did, her attention being fixed on the conversation through the door. "I merely strolled in on my way home, to ask you a question about something that has excited my curiosity," said the mayor with careless geniality. "But I see you have not finished supper." But I will be done in a little." "Ye needn't go, sir. Take a seat." "I've almost done, and it makes no difference at all." Henchard seemed to take the seat offered, and in a moment he resumed, "Well, first I should ask, did you write this?" A rustling of paper followed. "Yes, I did," said the Scotchman. "Then," said Henchard, "I am under the impression that we have met by accident while waiting for the morning to keep an appointment with each other." "My name is Henchard. You replied to an advertisement for a corn factor's manager that I put into the paper. You come here to see me about it?" "No," said the Scotchman, with some surprise. "Surely you are the man," went on Henchard, insistingly, "who arranged to come and see me." Joshua, Jip-Jop, what was his name?" "You're wrong," said the young man. "My name is Donald Farfrae. It is true I am in the corn trade, but I have replied to no advertisement, and arranged to see no one. I am on my way to Bristol, from there to the other side of the wall to try my fortune in the great wheat-growing districts of the west. I have some inventions useful to the trade, and there is no scope for developing them here. To America, well, said Henchard, in a tone of disappointment, so strong as to make itself felt like a damp atmosphere. And yet I could have sworn you were the man. The Scotchman murmured another negative, and there was a silence, till Henchard resumed. Then I am truly and sincerely obliged to you for the few words you wrote on that paper. It was nothing, sir. Well, it has a great importance for me just now. This row about my grown wheat, which I declare to heaven I didn't know to be bad till the people came complaining, has put me to my wits' end. I've some hundreds of quarters of it on hand, and if your renovating process will make it wholesome, why you can see what a quag 'twould get me out of. I saw in a moment there might be truth in it. But I should like to have it proved, and of course you don't care to the steps of the process sufficiently for me to do that, without my paying you well 40 first. The young man reflected a moment or two. I don't know that I have any objection, he said. I'm going to another country, and curing bad corn is not the line I'll take up there. Yes, I'll tell ye the whole of it, you'll make more out of it here than I will in a foreign country. Just look here a minute, sir. I can show ye by a sample in my carpet bag. The click of a lock followed, and there was a sifting and rustling, then a discussion about so many ounces to the bushel, and drying, and refrigerating, and so on. These few grains will be sufficient to show ye with, came in the young fellow's voice, and after a pause, during which some operation seemed to be intently watched by them both, he exclaimed, There, now do you taste that? It's complete, quite restored, or well nearly. Quite enough restored to make good seconds out of it, said the Scotchman. To fetch it back entirely is impossible, nature won't stand so much as that, but here you go a great way towards it. Well, sir, that's the process. I don't value it, for it can be but of little use in countries where the weather is more settled than in ours, and I'll be only too glad if it's of service to you. But, hearken to me, pleaded Henchard. My business, you know, is in corn and in hay, but I was brought up as a hay trusser simply, and hay is what I understand best, though I now do more in corn than in the other. If you'll accept the place, you shall manage the corn branch entirely, and receive a commission in addition to salary. You're liberal, very liberal, but no, I cannot, the young man still replied, with some distress in his accents. So be it, said Henchard conclusively. Now to change the subject, one good turn deserves another. Don't stay to finish that miserable supper. Come to my house. I can find something better for ye than cold ham and ale. Donald Farfrae was grateful, said he feared he must decline, that he wished to leave early next day. Very well, said Henchard quickly, please yourself. But I tell you, young man, if this holds good for the bulk, as it has done for the sample, you have saved my credit, stranger though you be. What shall I pay you for this knowledge? Nothing at all, nothing at all. It may not prove necessary to ye to use it often, and I don't value it at all. I thought I might just as well let ye know, as you were in a difficulty, and they were hard upon ye. Henchard paused. I shan't soon forget this, he said. And from a stranger. I couldn't believe you were not the man I had engaged. Says I to myself, he knows who I am, and recommends himself by this stroke. And yet it turns out, after all, that you are not the man who answered my advertisement, but a stranger. That's so, said the young man. Henchard again suspended his words, and then his voice came thoughtfully, your forehead, Farfrae, is something like my poor brother's, now dead and gone, and the nose, too, isn't unlike his. You must be, what, 5'9", I reckon. I am 6'1½ out of my shoes. But what of that? In my business, 'tis true that strength and bustle build up a firm. But judgment and knowledge are what keep it established. Unluckily, I am bad at science, Farfrae, bad at figures, a rule of thumb sort of man. You are just the reverse, I can see that. I have been looking for such as you these 2 years, and yet you are not for me. Well, before I go, let me ask this. Though you are not the young man I thought you were, what's the difference? Can't ye stay just the same? Have you really made up your mind about this American notion? I won't mince matters. I feel you would be invaluable to me. That needn't be said, and if you will bide and be my manager, I will make it worth your while. My plans are fixed, said the young man in negative tones. I have formed a scheme, and so we need not say any more about it. But will you not drink with me, sir? I find this Casterbridge ale warming to the stomach. No, no, I fain would, but I can't, said Henchard gravely, the scraping of his chair informing the listeners that he was rising to leave. When I was a young man, I went in for that sort of thing too strong, far too strong, and was well nigh ruined by it. I did a deed on account of it, which I shall be ashamed of to my dying day. It made such an impression on me that I swore, there and then, that I'd drink nothing stronger than tea for as many years as I was old that day. I have kept my oath, and though, far frae, I am sometimes that dry in the dog days asterisk, that I could drink a quarter barrel to the pitching, asterisk I think o' my oath, and touch no strong drink at all. I'll no press ye, so I'll no press ye. I respect your vow. Well, I shall get a manager somewhere, no doubt, said Henchard, with strong feeling in his tones. But it will be long before I see one that would suit me so well. The young man appeared much moved by Henchard's warm convictions of his value. He was silent till they reached the door. I wish I could stay, sincerely I would like to, he replied. But no, it can net be. It can net. I want to see the Wold.